If you learn one thing from this video, then please let it be to keep your seatbelt on when you're sitting down during flight, even if the fasten seatbelt sign is off. You see, even a loosely fastened seatbelt can help prevent injury if your flight suddenly hits some turbulence. But why should you even have to do that? Why can't the pilots just warn you when the plane is about to hit turbulence? And is turbulence actually getting worse? Stay tuned. Turbulence is a huge worry for a lot of passengers, especially nervous flyers, and unfortunately we recently got an example of just how bad it can be with Singapore Airlines flight SQ321. This flight was operated using a Boeing 777-300ER, which departed from London in the UK, heading towards Singapore on the 21st of May this year, carrying 211 passengers and 18 crew. Obviously, this is a very recent accident, so we don't have the final report on it yet, but we do have some preliminary findings which are explaining the basic sequence of events. The flight's departure from London and most of its cruise over Europe and Asia seems to have been completely uneventful, but about 10 hours into the flight, as the 777 was maintaining flight level 370 over the south of Myanmar, the preliminary report said that it was likely flying over an area of developing convective activity, and I'll get back to what that means later on. In any case, that was the moment when the flight first just hit some light turbulence, most likely a temporary updraft, which simultaneously had two effects. First, the aircraft and its occupants experienced some vertical accelerations, which fluctuated between plus 0.44 and 1.57 g, where 1 g equals the force of the gravity we normally experience. So with these values, the passengers would have first felt a bit lighter than slightly heavier than normal. The second effect was that the aircraft's altitude and airspeed started increasing at the same time. The altitude changed from 37,000 feet to 37,362 feet over a period of about 19 seconds. Now, the autopilot obviously noticed this and started bringing the aircraft back down again, while the pilots extended the speed brakes to hinder the acceleration. Now, that is all consistent with the effect of a normal updraft, and while all this was happening, the pilots also switched on the fasten seatbelt sign, but unfortunately, several passengers weren't fast enough to react to this. Because just 8 to 10 seconds after that initial disturbance, the aircraft started going through some much more violent vertical accelerations. This time, they ranged from plus 1.35 to minus 1.5 g, and the changes between those extremes happened very fast, initially just 0.6 seconds, and then they remained with a negative g value for a couple of seconds after that. And that second bout of turbulence, it was caused many of the unbelted passengers to first hit the roof before then crashing back down as the vertical acceleration went back to plus 1.5 g during the following 4 seconds. The turbulence then continued with much lower positive g fluctuations over the coming 24 seconds, and the entire sequence from that initial smaller upset, which caused the altitude increase, to the very last fluctuations lasted only about 1 minute and 2 seconds. But that was sadly enough. Over the next several minutes, the pilots then communicated with the cabin crew to evaluate the situation, and when they found out that they had several injuries on board, they quickly decided to divert to Bangkok in Thailand, where they landed just under an hour after the event. By then, ambulance and rescue personnel were waiting for them, and initial reports said that 7 people were at that point in critical condition, with 23 other passengers and 7 crew members suffering less serious injuries. Tragically, a 73-year-old British citizen also died because of a heart issue which she likely experienced as a result of the event. On the following day, when another Singapore Airlines aircraft came to pick the passengers up, a total of 79 passengers and 6 crew had to stay in hospitals in Bangkok, either because they were injured themselves or because of injured companions. Now, we will hear more about this event and what everyone in the industry can learn from it when the final report is finally published. But the industry is already studying any lessons that we can from this event and considering a few changes as well, which I'll get back to after this. When we're on the topic of turbulence, do you know what else can be really bumpy? Well, shaving with a bad razor. I hate that feeling, and that's why I have recently switched over to Henson and their fantastic AL13 razor. I was actually thrilled when I heard that they wanted to sponsor this episode, because Henson stands for exactly that timeless type of quality that I really love. Unlike most other racers who let the blade flex and vibrate, the AL13 supports the blade perfectly, which means a super close shave, making my skin feel great without any irritation. Seriously, the engineering behind this thing is incredible, and that's maybe not so strange coming from a company that's also made parts for the Mars rover. Another thing I really like is that the AL13 is completely plastic-free, even the packaging, and its standard double-edged blades are fully recyclable, making it a very eco-friendly razor to use. But to be honest, what really makes a difference there is that it's made to last for decades. So if you are interested in getting your hands on some real precision shaving gear, then I recommend giving the Henson AL13 a try. And you can do so by clicking on the link here below, which is hensonshaving.com/now. If you use that and the code NOW, you will get 100 free razor blades when you buy a razor. Just remember to add both the razor and the blades to your cart for the code to take effect. Thank you, Henson. Now let's continue. Now, let's have a look at how and why these events happen and why it is sometimes very hard to identify them in time. Generally speaking, an aircraft experiences turbulence when it's moving through disturbed air, and there are several different reasons that can cause this. First, we have something called mechanical turbulence, which generally happens when we are lower down close to the ground. This happens due to surface friction and ground obstructions like buildings, trees, nearby hills and mountains, basically anything that can disturb and redirect airflow along the path that we fly. As a passenger, you will sometimes feel this during takeoff or landing in windy conditions, and while this might make the flight a bit more uncomfortable, it very rarely leads to any injuries. The reason for that is that both passengers and cabin crew will typically be wearing their seatbelts at those lower altitudes, so even though this is typically the most scary kind of turbulence, it's actually almost never dangerous. A bit related to this, we also have something known as mountain wave turbulence. As its name suggests, this is a turbulence caused by high mountain formations, a bit like mechanical turbulence, but during the right or wrong conditions, the effects of mountains can disrupt air much higher up than the mountains themselves, sometimes even higher than our cruise altitudes. You can sometimes see the traces of this form of turbulence because the waves can cause distinctly shaped curved lenticular clouds when there's enough moisture. Now, the kind of turbulence that these waves create is often less obvious for passengers, but can be a real pain for the pilots as it often causes cyclical changes in both altitude and airspeed, which can be quite tricky to deal with. While we're speaking of available moisture in the atmosphere, another category of turbulence we have is something known as convective turbulence. And as the name suggests, this is caused by the convective movement of the air and the clouds that are being created through it. In this case, some clouds are created when the sun heats up the Earth's surface, often unevenly, causing small air masses to warm up and rise like bubbles, taking with it a fair amount of moisture inside. When those bubbles then rise higher and higher, they cool down until the moisture inside of them starts to turn from vapor into droplets. That happens when the so-called dew point matches the outside air temperature, and then clouds are formed. Now, the clouds that are formed this way are called cumulus clouds, and the process that creates them actually releases energy in addition to the vertical movement of the air itself. So the combination of both these factors, both the air moving up, which can cause turbulence even before the cloud is created, and the release of energy inside of the cloud, turns into that kind of convective turbulence that I was just mentioning. And if you are a frequent flyer, you have definitely experienced this type of turbulence. It basically happens every time that you fly through those white, fluffy-looking good weather clouds, and it's rarely very dangerous, but it can be quite choppy from time to time. This type of turbulence is easy to predict because we see the clouds and we know that the turbulence is going to be below those clouds. This is actually what glider pilots are using in order to gain height. And we also know that it will be inside of those clouds. So what we do is we just wait with releasing passengers and cabin crew until we pass above them. Now, this type of turbulence can sometimes appear on our weather radar, but it's often not enough moisture inside of these type of clouds to show anything useful. But that's only as long as we're talking about the smaller, white, fluffy cumulus clouds. If the convective process continues and the clouds grows into a larger cumulonimbus cloud, what we refer to as a CB, then it's a completely different ballgame. CBs are what you would call storm clouds, and you can identify them either by their sheer size, their black color at the bottom, and the fact that they expand at the top in a fuzzy way, making them almost look like mushrooms. Now, those CBs can appear in groups or by themselves, and they form either through the process I explained before or along a cold front where warm, moist air is being forced upwards by the cooler air below it, and no matter how these are formed, they can be really, really nasty. CBs can reach quite high altitude, sometimes even higher than we can fly, but fortunately spotting and avoiding them generally isn't a real problem. Visually, they are very hard to miss, and they have a lot of moisture inside of them, so they light up our weather radars pretty well. CBs are dangerous and can cause everything from hail damage to actual structural issues if we would fly through them, but since they tend to be very localized and, as I mentioned, easy to see on our weather radar, we always avoid them with a large margin. But there are two other types of turbulence that we can't see, and because of that, they tend to account for most of the injuries to passengers and crew during the cruise phase. One kind of turbulence that can seemingly come from nowhere is something known as wake turbulence or wake vortex turbulence. As the name suggests, this type of turbulence happens when we're suddenly hit by disturbed air left behind by another aircraft. You see, as we fly, all aircraft leave behind these horizontal vortexes emanating from their wingtips, and this happens because the high pressure under the wings tries to escape outwards and around the top of the wings to reach the lower pressure up there. Now, this causes a swirling motion, forming a constant helical shape behind the wingtips like a horizontal tornado, basically. Now, this type of turbulence is stronger nearer to the ground, where the air is thicker, the aircraft speeds are lower, and the wings tend to have their flaps and slats extended, generating more lift and therefore an even bigger pressure difference between the top and the bottom side of the wings. That's actually why there are strict rules around how much separation there needs to be between two aircraft, both during landing and takeoff, and air traffic control is keeping a close eye on this to make sure that we're all safe. Now, while we're up in the cruise, ATC is actually also keeping an eye on this, but it becomes a little bit more complicated up there since these vortices also tend to fall slowly at a speed of about 400 feet per minute. And that means that if we, for example, would see something big, like an Airbus A380, cross our path 1,000 feet above, well, then we know that in about 2.5 minutes we will risk potentially flying through those vortices if we're not careful. Now, if you have ever been out flying and it's been perfectly calm and then suddenly the aircraft just shakes like you've flown over a huge bump or something, well then you have likely touched one of those vortexes. Over on the Mentour Pilot channel, I've actually done a video where I covered an accident where a business jet experienced exactly this and was literally flipped upside down. But in most circumstances, the only thing that you'll feel is just a nasty sudden jolt. Now, depending on the airspace we're in, there are different ways to mitigate the problem of wake turbulence. For example, by offsetting or deviating laterally from our track, or just ask air traffic control for a slight turn in order to avoid it. Air traffic control are also making sure that there is sufficient spacing between different aircraft, so it shouldn't be happening in the first place. Now, we won't be able to see the wake turbulence in most cases since it doesn't turn up on our weather radar, but sometimes you can actually see it affecting the contrails, and then it's a little bit easier. In any case, since we can see the aircraft causing the vortexes, it is normally a kind of turbulence that is perfectly avoidable. But the last type of turbulence I want to discuss doesn't offer us any such clues, and it's called clear air turbulence, or CAT. The most common cause of this type of turbulence is something known as jet streams, which is a fast-moving current of wind like a reasonably narrow river up in the air. These type of jets are created thanks to temperature differences between different air masses, and they're not all bad. We often like to use them if they give us strong tailwind, since that would bring us to where we're going much faster. Every time that you see a newspaper headline about some record-setting flight over the Atlantic, a jet stream is always involved. And since we are effectively just traveling inside of a fast-moving air mass, we're not overspeeding the aircraft. We're flying the same airspeed as we always do, it's just the ground speed which becomes higher. Now, jet streams don't always lead to clear air turbulence, but when they do, it's almost always worst near the edges of the jet. And that's where the air starts to brush up against the slower moving air outside. And since we don't really know where those edges are, we can't always predict where the turbulence will appear. The good news though is that because these jet streams are almost always narrow and shallow, even a small altitude change can often get us out of them. And on top of that, the meteorologists are very good at predicting where these areas of expected turbulence are so we can plan for and avoid it. But there are also some other possible causes for clear air turbulence. Like I mentioned before, mountain waves can sometimes create the same effect without any clouds to warn us, and sometimes flying close to or above convective clouds, like CBs, can have that same effect. So if we go back to the Singapore Airlines accident in May, the investigators' interim report said that when the turbulence hit, the aircraft was likely flying over an area of developing convective activity. And that's report lingo for flying above developing thunderstorms. And those things can grow with thousands of feet per minute and easily cause sudden turbulence above them if the aircraft is close enough. So judging from that wording in the interim report, that's probably what the investigators are currently looking at. But how serious is clear air turbulence? How can we deal with it, and what's going to happen with it in the future? Well, according to some researchers, the cost of turbulence to the aviation industry is actually quite high, around $200 million per year in the United States alone, and that estimate dates back to 2003. So with inflation and much more aircraft flying, the real numbers are likely quite a bit worse by now. Some of these costs has to do with the extra checks that airlines have to do after an aircraft has had a turbulence encounter in order to verify that the aircraft is structurally sound. In theory, regular exposure to bad turbulence could cause fatigue to the airframes, so basically that's why those checks are in place, but you shouldn't be afraid of the aircraft actually breaking up because of turbulence. Aircraft are checked before they are being delivered to be able to fly through way more turbulence than you could ever imagine. But on top of that extra maintenance, airlines also lose money because of extra fuel burn when we fly around weather or have to change altitude frequently to avoid it. But probably the biggest cost of turbulence for the industry is injury compensation made to passengers and crews. Now, again, I really want to stress here that the majority of these injuries are not serious. The most common example of such injuries includes scalding from spilled hot drinks like coffee and tea, which are of course annoying and painful but not life-threatening. But the unpredictable nature of clear air turbulence means that there is a real risk for more serious injuries, especially for cabin crew who tend to still be working even when the seatbelt sign is on. They do that, by the way, on their own responsibility and can discontinue their service whenever they deem that they can't continue safely. If we pilots see that we're getting into an area of bad turbulence, then we will often brief the cabin crew beforehand or just give them a direct order to sit down. But is it actually true that turbulence is now getting worse? So will future flights be more likely to encounter severe turbulence? Well, as it turns out, there is some good, some bad, and some neutral news here. Let's start with the bad news. To find out how turbulence will likely look in the future, we have to look at some large-scale meteorological studies. In those, researchers look at weather data and statistics gathered over time and then combine them with climate models adjusted for expected future changes to our climate. Unsurprisingly, a lot of academic studies have been done on this subject over recent years, and they're all made slightly differently, looking at different timescales and datasets, but broadly speaking, they all agree on one thing. Yes, our changing climate will make clear air turbulence more prevalent in the future, and that's because the studies show an increase in vertical shear in the horizontal wind. In other words, updraft and downdraft near the boundaries of jet streams do have a tendency to get stronger as the climate gets warmer. Now, this is of course a big oversimplification. The result of the studies all vary in their intensity of the change they predict, plus not all parts of the world will be affected in the same way. That's partly because the jet streams themselves vary in altitude as we change latitude, getting much lower near the Earth's poles and higher near the equator. But again, it is likely that we will see more clear air turbulence in the future overall. Okay, so that was the bad news, but here comes some better ones. Remember that I asked 2 questions before? The first one was, is turbulence getting worse over time? Which it looked like it is, but I also asked, will future flights actually be more likely to encounter severe turbulence? The answer to that last question is much less clear, and I'll tell you why. One way we can try to study this is to look at actual historical reports of aviation turbulence accidents and how these have changed over time. Now obviously, for that to make any sense, we would need to adjust those numbers for the increase in the total number of flights over the years as well. And to do that, for this video, we looked at 2 different sets of data. One set uses ICAO data over an 11-year period between 2013 and 2023, and it shows how turbulence accidents varied in relation to other types of accidents during that time frame. The other is a 3-decade set of NTSB data from the United States, looking at how clear air turbulence compares to other types of turbulence between 1992 and 2023. This is relevant because the meteorological studies predicting an increase are specifically predicting an increase in clear air turbulence. Now, when we look at these sets, we can see that turbulence-related accidents have had some highs and lows, including spikes during certain years, but it is very difficult to identify any specific pattern in them. Now, at this point, I should also mention that at least some of the academic studies that I mentioned before also took some of this information into account, but many of these studies avoided using empirical data completely, and to be honest, that's quite easy to see why they did that. You see, for my team, gathering this information was the most time-consuming part of researching this video, and even after that job, we don't claim that this data is complete. The problem here is that aviation authorities don't necessarily collect accident and incident information in a consistent manner over time or consistent with what other authorities are doing. In other words, this just isn't good qualitative data. Now, you may find this lack of an increase in clear air turbulence encounters surprising, since this topic has been in the news on and off for quite some time now. And actually, a survey among pilots and other aviation professionals shows that they actually consider turbulence to be one of the industry's biggest worries for the future. But that brings me to the good news, and we have plenty of it. Firstly, we need to point out that another reason why the real-world turbulence accident data isn't very useful is because there just isn't enough of it. We can't see patterns in the data because actually these types of accidents are exceedingly rare. And the best news is probably that the aviation industry is not just sitting still as we try to figure out what sort of skies that we will be flying in the future. No, we are constantly working on ways to deal with the issue of clear air turbulence so that even if it gets worse in the future, we won't suffer that much from it. For example, figuring out ways to detect the so far undetectable clear air turbulence is something that the industry is trying to solve right now. LIDAR, which is basically a laser version of radar, could theoretically detect changes in air movements even without the moisture that our current weather radars are depending on. Unfortunately though, using LIDAR this way isn't very practical yet. It is less effective in the high altitude thin air than it has been down on the ground tests, and it is also really expensive. In fact, the cost to install LiDAR systems in airliners today would likely be much higher than the current total cost that clear air turbulence is causing the industry. By the way, this kind of nerdy discussions is exactly what I love to cover in my hangouts with my Patreon crew. I actually think that this topic was suggested by one of them. Anyways, there could also be other methods of detecting clear air turbulence in the future, using improved forecasting models and weather satellites, for example. But another promising method is to improve one of the ways that we pilots already use to deal with turbulence. You see, at the moment, pilots always make pilot reports or PIREPs whenever we encounter moderate or severe turbulence. This helps to warn other pilots in the same area and also causes air traffic control to note down where that PIREP took place and then warn other traffic that is getting closer to that area. But the problem is that PIREPs aren't always coming when you need them, and even when they do, they can be a little bit inconsistent. Some aircraft can take turbulence better than others and therefore not notice it as much, and pilots may evaluate turbulence differently as well. But there are now ways to basically automate PIREPs in a more consistent and timely way by installing sensors in the aircraft that can handle that process once turbulence goes over a certain threshold. In 2020, IATA introduced a program called Turbulence Aware, which attempts to do exactly that. In that program, data about turbulence is transmitted in real time, alerting airlines and crews flying in the same airways about the location and severity. And this data could even help meteorologists gather more precise information in order to study clear air turbulence more precisely. Now, unfortunately, Turbulence Aware isn't a free service, and until recently, only 21 out of around 300 IATA member airlines had taken part of it, which I just think is super silly. But it seems that maybe the Singapore Airlines accident is driving up demand for it, because Emirates, for example, joined the program at the end of May, just after this accident. Finally, the airlines are now also considering other moves, like introducing rules to make keeping your seatbelt on when you're seated mandatory instead of just a friendly suggestion. But frankly, a lot of airlines don't want to do this for a number of reasons. One of them being that on long flights, you really should get up and stretch your legs from time to time, because deep vein thrombosis is another real danger. But please, if you are sitting down, keep that seatbelt loosely fastened. Now, my team and I are spending hours and hours on researching these type of videos, and one of the reasons that we can do that is because of the help of my amazing Patreon crew. If you want to join up and support what we do, then use the link in the description below or somewhere here on the screen. It's hugely helpful. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.